I'm just falling.
Grace and peace. Happy GODfident Mondays. 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 7. For the spirit that God has given us does not make us timid. Instead, his spirit fills us with power, love, and self-control. Grace and peace, family. Happy GODfident Mondays. Last week, we spoke from the understanding of fear. False evidence appearing to be real. Well, today I need you to understand that there's an effect that fear has. There's a residue that fear leaves. Because when fear isn't dealt with, when fear isn't wiped out, when fear isn't completely burnt out, there's a residue that is left. And the residue that fear leaves creates apprehension. The residue that fear leaves creates delay. The residue that fear leaves creates an alteration in your performance. The residue that fear leaves creates faulty thinking. The residue that fear leaves creates faulty decision making. So part of the reason why you can't even see better in your situation is because fear has left a residue that has caused scales over your eyesight. The residue of fear has caused an issue with your faith. Because faith cannot operate where fear resides. So the residue of fear has caused an issue. And how you think, how you perceive, how you understand, how you act. God says he intends to do away with fear because, again, God hasn't given us the spirit of fear, but he's given us power. He's given us love. He's given us a sound mind. We understand that the spirit of fear doesn't come from our God, but the spirit of fear comes from the Christ. The spirit of fear comes from the enemy. But there's some examples in the word of God to lay out the residue and result of the spirit of fear. The spirit of fear held the children of Israel stagnant. And because of the spirit of fear, because of the residue of fear, every time the children of Israel came against an issue, came against a circumstance, they were hindered by the residue of fear, which kept them ultimately from crossing over into the promised land. That is the reason why in Exodus, the children of Israel who came out of Egypt, the generation that came out of Egypt was not the same generation that crossed over into the promised land, because that generation had a residue on them that they would not give up. There was a residue of fear on the soldiers with King Saul, because when it came up against Goliath, they were so fearful of Goliath that they couldn't move. Goliath cursed them and cursed God for days until David showed up. And although David was such a young fellow, he showed up beyond his years. He showed up in faith, because faith defies logic, faith defies time, faith defies understanding. But in faith, you know what you're capable of in God. Sometimes the residue of fear can start well before you in your existence. Sometimes the residue of fear can be generational, because when Gideon was called to lead the army into the defeat of the Midianites, Gideon couldn't even believe that he was chosen. And when God spoke to him, his response to God was, "How could you choose me? How could you call me? How could you appoint me when I'm the least of my family?" Sometimes residue is generational. Sometimes residue goes beyond you. It's something that came before you. But it's time for us to step into faith. Because faith needs to completely do away with the residue of fear. Because what God has called you for, what God has chosen you to do, you can't have nothing left over of fear. There can't be no residue. There used to be residue, but right now God has called you to leave a residue of faith. There was a residue of fear in your generation, in your family, but God has called you to do the opposite. God has called you to change. God has called you to shift. God has called you to understand that He's appointed you. He's made you. He's formed you to defy the elements of nature, to defy the circumstance, to defy the situation. Finances don't have you. The family doesn't have you. Your mind doesn't have you. Fear has you. The residue is lingering in your thoughts and in your perspective of situations. But faith says, I'm more than capable. I'm more than a conqueror because I was created with dominion and authority. Faith says I speak things that are not as though they were. So I don't got to wait to see it in the physical because I know that I can speak the shift in the spirit so it can be made manifest in the natural. In Philippians, Paul wrote, I concentrate on the things that are pure, that are righteous, that are just, that are of good report. I think on these things. He said, make this a part of your everyday living. You need to put this into practice. Put into practice thinking right. Put into practice thinking pure. Put into practice canceling those negative thoughts. Put into practice completely doing away with the residue of fear and replacing it with the residue of faith. Because when you operate in faith, it's going to leave a residue. It's going to leave witnesses who marvel at the Godfidence you were able to speak in, the Godfidence you were able to walk in, the Godfidence you were able to live in. The residue of faith. We're doing away with the residue of fear and we're stepping into faith, leaving a residue of faith behind us. Grace and peace, family. Happy Godfident Mondays.